Eric never thought his job at the logistics company would cost him the girl he loved. It wasn't glamorous, he knew that. He wasn't flying across countries or making flashy business deals at rooftop parties. He managed operations for warehouse, shipments, kept inventory tight, and made sure deliveries got from point A to point B without a hiccup. It was the kind of job that kept the world running quietly, and maybe that was the problem. Quiet, predictable, safe. Apparently to Lacy, that translated to one word: boring. When she said it, she didn't even try to soften the blow. Eric still remembered the way her lips curled, almost like she'd been holding it back for months. "Eric," she sighed, tossing her hair over her shoulder like she was shaking off the weight of their relationship. "I just can't keep pretending. You're a great guy, really, but this life? It's not exciting. It's not me." He could only stare at her, the words catching like rough gravel in his throat. He wanted to argue, to tell her excitement isn't what keeps people together, that stability matters. But looking into her eyes, he could see she'd already checked, out long before this conversation. Her mind was already somewhere else, somewhere flashier, somewhere louder, somewhere that didn't look anything like the small, clean apartment they shared. The worst part wasn't the breakup itself. It was how quickly she seemed to move on. Within a week, Lacy's social media turned into a highlight reel of parties, brunches, and sun-soaked selfies with captions about living her best life. Eric told himself not to look, but he did. God, he did. Each photo felt like another tiny punch to the gut. Days turned into weeks, and Eric buried himself in work. He stayed late, picked up extra projects, and even helped out in departments that weren't his responsibility. Not because he loved the job, but because the alternative was lying awake at night, picturing Lacy in some stranger's arms. Then, like some twisted joke, it happened. He was sorting through a new stack of internal applications for an assistant role. The department had been growing, and Eric had finally convinced upper management to approve support staff. He flipped through the resumes, eyes scanning mechanically until he froze. There it was, Lacy Pearson. Her name sat there on the application, like a ghost from a nightmare, bold and unbothered. Eric's pulse spiked, and for a moment, he wondered if he was hallucinating from lack of sleep. But no, it was real. Same name, same signature looping across the bottom of the page. She had applied to be his assistant. His lips twitched in a bitter, humorless smirk. So much for her exciting new life. He couldn't help but let his mind spiral into messy places. Was she struggling? Regretting her choices? Or was this just a stepping stone for her? A temporary pit stop before she latched onto the next big thing? As much as he wanted to rip the application in half and toss it straight into the shredder, he didn't. Professionalism. He clung to it like a life raft. He tucked her resume into the review pile with shaking hands and kept going, though his chest felt tight. The following week, interviews began. Eric thought maybe she wouldn't show. Maybe it was just an impulsive move she'd already forgotten. But no. She walked into the office at 10:15 sharp, heels clicking confidently against the tile, dressed sharper than he'd ever seen her. Her eyes flicked to him, widening just a fraction when she saw who was leading the interviews. "Eric?" Her voice caught for just a second, then smoothed out like nothing had happened. She slid into the chair across from him, cool as ever, folding her hands in her lap. Eric inhaled slowly, meeting her gaze. He could see something different now, something she tried to hide beneath her polished exterior. A flicker of hesitation, maybe even regret. "Good morning, Lacy," he said, keeping his tone steady. "Let's begin." But inside, everything was anything but steady. Lacy's smile tightened, like she was bracing for a storm but pretending it was just a breeze. Eric noticed. He noticed everything now. The way she crossed her legs too quickly, the way her eyes darted toward the door for half a second before settling back on him. It wasn't the same confident, carefree Lacy who had walked out of his life claiming she wanted more excitement. No, this was someone who had tasted that excitement and maybe found it a little bitter. He ran through the standard questions, forcing himself to treat her like any other candidate. Experience, availability, willingness to work under pressure. She answered smoothly at first, but he caught the cracks beneath her words. When he asked about how she handled stressful situations, her eyes flickered just a bit too long, as if the question landed closer to home than she'd expected. "I've learned to adapt," she said, her voice calm but lacking its usual charm. "Sometimes you think you know what you want, but reality teaches you otherwise, or—" Eric raised an eyebrow, but he didn't respond. He noted her answer and kept moving, but a part of him twisted at her words. Was that a confession? A quiet apology buried under professional politeness? He didn't know, and honestly, he wasn't sure if he even cared to unpack it. The interview wrapped up in 20 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime. When it ended, she stood, smoothing down her skirt, her gaze lingering on him just a second too long. "It was good to see you again." "Eric," she said softly. He gave a polite nod. "You as well, Lacy." She hesitated at the door, her hand on the frame, as if there was something else she wanted to say. But instead, she just left, her heels fading down the corridor until there was only silence. Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He stared at the stack of resumes, but her name burned in his mind like it had been carved into the desk. He told himself it didn't matter. He would choose the most qualified candidate. End of story. Personal history had no place here. Yet, over the next few days, her face kept flashing through his thoughts. He tried to bury himself in work, like always, but it wasn't as easy this time. He kept wondering, why did she apply? Out of all the companies, all the places in the city, why here? Why his department? Shelley, one of the HR coordinators, popped her head into his office later that week. "Hey, Eric, about the assistant role," she began, flipping through her folder. "Honestly, Lacy Pearson's got solid experience. Her background in event coordination lines up with what we need for logistics support. She'd be a good fit." Eric's stomach tightened. He kept his expression neutral. "She's under consideration," he replied, keeping it brief. Shelley paused, sensing the shift in his tone. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't push. "All right," she said, backing out of the room, just flagging it. Left alone, Eric leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His mind ran in circles, replaying old memories of Lacy sitting across from him at their kitchen table, teasing him about his spreadsheets and shipping forecasts. Back then, she used to call him Mr. Numbers. She'd said it with affection then. Now it felt like an accusation. Justin, his colleague and occasional drinking buddy, caught up with him later that evening in the break room. "You all right, man? You've been looking like you saw a ghost." Eric gave a dry laugh. "Something like that." Justin cracked open a soda and leaned against the counter. "HR's buzzing about that assistant role. Heard you got some interesting, candidates." "Yeah," Eric replied, choosing his words carefully. "You could say that." Justin shot him a knowing look, but didn't press. "Well, whoever you pick, just make sure they don't come with a storm attached. Easier said than done." As the final decision day loomed, Eric found himself standing at the crossroads of professionalism and personal history. Part of him wanted to reject her out of pure self-preservation, spare himself the awkwardness, the history, the daily reminder of what she had thrown away. But another part, the colder, more calculating part, wondered if hiring her might just flip the balance of power between them. Let her see the life she dismissed. Let her see what she walked, away from every single day. And maybe, just maybe, that thought tempted him more than he wanted to admit. The morning of the final decision, Eric stood by his office window, staring out at the city like it might give him some kind of answer. Cars crawled through traffic. People hurried down the sidewalks, oblivious to the storm brewing inside his chest. He had already delayed longer than he should have. Shelley had emailed him twice, politely reminding him they needed to finalize the assistant hire today to stay on schedule. His phone buzzed on the desk. Another message from Shelley. "Hey, Eric, just nudge me with your pick before noon, please." "Thanks." Eric ran a hand down his face, then glanced again at the short list of final candidates. They were all decent, but there she was, Lacy Pearson, standing out like a red mark on clean paper. She wasn't the most qualified, not technically, but she wasn't the worst either. She was right in that dangerous middle zone, where the decision could go either way and no one would question it too hard. With a breath that felt heavier than it should, he clicked her name. A choice made. A line crossed. Shelley confirmed a few minutes later, cheerful as always. "All right, I'll send her the offer today." Eric stared at the screen long after the notification disappeared, a bitter taste rising at the back of his throat. He told himself it was just business. Just business. The following Monday, she walked in as if no awkward history existed between them. She wore a pale blue blouse that framed her shoulders neatly, a little too polished for the warehouse office, but maybe that was her way of overcompensating. Her eyes met his briefly, and for a heartbeat, they flickered with something almost too quick to name, not regret. No, it felt closer to vulnerability. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she greeted him, formal and precise, as if she could pretend she was meeting him for the first time. He played along. "Morning, Lacy. Let's get you settled." As he led her through the office, explaining procedures and daily expectations, a strange knot of satisfaction tightened in his chest. He caught her taking in the scale of the operation, warehouse maps pinned to walls, digital dashboards, tracking shipments in real time, teams of employees coordinating under his quiet command. This wasn't the small, boring job she'd dismissed so easily. This was responsibility, leadership, power. And now, she answered to him. For a moment, he wondered if she felt the weight of that. Her posture was straight, her replies crisp, but there were moments, tiny cracks, when her gaze lingered on him too long, or when her lips pressed together after a subtle pause. She noticed, all right. Whether she'd admit it or not, she noticed. As the hours slipped by, Eric found himself observing her more than necessary. She worked efficiently, picking up tasks quickly, almost too quickly. She handled reports, coordinated shipment schedules, and drafted emails without needing much guidance. It annoyed him in a way he couldn't quite explain, maybe because it reminded him of how she had always been capable, how she could thrive if she wanted, but had chosen to chase shallow thrills instead. By late afternoon, he caught her by the break room, scrolling through her phone with a pinched expression. The screen glowed brightly, casting shadows across her face. He caught a glimpse of a text notification before she locked it. "Tonight? Same place. Drinks on me from someone named Blake." His chest tightened, irrational and sharp. He shouldn't care. He really shouldn't care. But there it was, a spike of heat in his veins. "You settling in okay?" he asked, forcing his tone into something smooth and unreadable. She startled slightly, then smiled, a bit too quickly. "Yes. It's actually more interesting than I expected." "Good to hear," he replied, though his mind wasn't anywhere near the words. He wondered if she meant it, or if it was just another line, another performance in a life full of performances. As the day wound down, Eric watched her gather her things, her movements careful, like she was walking a tightrope she wasn't sure she could balance on. For a moment, their eyes met across the office. Neither of them spoke, but something unspoken passed between them. A quiet tension, stretched taut, but not yet snapping. Eric turned back to his monitor, but his thoughts were far from spreadsheets and shipment logs. Something was beginning to stir beneath the surface, dark and unresolved. This story between them wasn't over. No, it was just beginning. The next few days unfolded like a quiet storm brewing in the distance, subtle at first but steadily building. Eric tried to keep his focus sharp, but with Lacy working just a few steps away, it was like walking past an old wound every hour, feeling it throb beneath the surface. She kept her professionalism intact, never slipping, never hinting at the history they shared, but it was there, hanging between them like invisible fog. Every time she approached his desk, she kept her tone neutral, her gaze steady. "Eric, the shipment to Denver is delayed. I've contacted the supplier, but they need a confirmation from you." "Send it through," he'd reply, not looking up, keeping the mask firmly in place. But beneath that calm surface, something twisted inside him. It wasn't just about her being here. It was what she represented. Her presence reminded him of every time she'd looked at him with thinly veiled disappointment, every sigh when he'd come home late from work, tired but satisfied with the day's progress. She had always wanted more. More excitement, more adventure, more anything that wasn't him, and now she was here, filing reports and fetching data for the man she once dismissed as boring. Justin picked up on the tension before long. Over a late lunch at the nearby cafe, he leaned across the table, lowering his voice. "Man, I know it's not my place, but seriously, why'd you hire her?" Eric stirred his coffee slowly, watching the swirl of cream spiral toward the bottom. "Because she was qualified." "Yeah," Justin scoffed, "but so were half a dozen others who didn't share your entire relationship history." Eric didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could feel the truth crawling under his skin like an itch he couldn't scratch. Maybe this wasn't about qualifications at all. Maybe this was about something darker, something petty, something he wasn't ready to admit to himself yet. Back at the office, Shelley seemed to notice too. She didn't say anything outright, but her glances lingered a little longer when Lacy handed off reports. Her expressions hovered somewhere between curiosity and quiet concern. If she had suspicions, she kept them to herself. For now. That evening, Eric stayed late, poring over the logistics dashboard long after the rest of the staff had gone home. Except for Lacy, she lingered by her desk, typing up final emails, pretending she didn't notice he was still there. But she did. He caught her watching him in the reflection of the office window, her gaze sharp yet distant, as if she was trying to figure him out all over again. Eventually, she stood and gathered her things. Her steps were slow as she approached his desk. "You always work this late?" she asked, her voice softer than usual, a shadow of old familiarity creeping in. "Only when I care about the outcome," he replied coolly. She bit her lower lip, an old nervous habit he remembered well. No, I used to think this job was small, but it's not, is it?" He held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "No, it's not." Silence settled between them, heavy and complicated. She hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I never thought I'd say this, but you've built something real here, Eric." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Part of him wanted to believe her sincerity, but another part warned him it could be another performance, another well-timed compliment to ease her path. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a measured look. "Funny. Took you long enough to see it." Her breath caught just slightly, and for the first time since she started working there, her confidence slipped. It was a small crack, but it was there. Without waiting for a response, Eric turned his attention back to his screen, dismissing her like she was any other employee. A quiet, ruthless satisfaction curled in his chest as he heard her footsteps retreating toward the door. But as the door clicked shut behind her, that satisfaction soured into something else. Something colder. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of it. She had come back into his orbit for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it wasn't finished yet. And neither was he. The next morning, Eric arrived earlier than usual. He told himself it was just to clear a backlog of emails, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. He wanted to see if she'd come in early too. Part of him hated that he cared, hated how much space she still occupied in his thoughts. But there it was, gnawing quietly at the edges of his mind. She didn't disappoint. Lacy walked through the door a few minutes later, earlier than any of the other assistants, carrying a to-go cup of coffee and a folder tucked under her arm. Her eyes flicked to him across the office, and for a moment something passed between them that felt heavier than simple workplace pleasantries. She approached his desk with careful steps, her voice crisp and professional. "I thought you might want this early," she said, placing the updated schedule in front of him. "Denver shipment's back on track." "Good," Eric replied, keeping his tone even. He didn't thank her. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. But as she turned to leave, he caught her pause, just for a second. A subtle hesitation, like she wanted to say something more but swallowed it back. He let her walk away. The hours ticked by, and Eric found himself watching her more than he should have. She worked efficiently, her focus tight, her expressions guarded. Yet, every so often, her composure would slip. He caught her staring out the window, lost in thought. He caught her lips pressed together too tightly after a phone call. She was carrying something beneath that polished surface, something she wasn't ready to reveal. By midday, Justin swung by Eric's desk, a knowing glint in his eye. "Drinks after work?" he offered, leaning on the partition. "You could use it." Eric's first instinct was to decline, but then an idea sparked in his mind. "Actually," he said slowly, "yeah, let's go." As the day closed, he made sure Lacy overheard them making plans. She didn't react at first, but Eric didn't miss the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way she held her breath for half a beat before continuing her work. It was a small victory, but he took it. That evening at the bar, Justin slid a drink over to Eric and raised his glass. "To letting go of the past," Justin toasted, his grin half playful, half serious. Eric clinked his glass, though the words rang hollow in his mind. Letting go? No, he wasn't letting go. Not yet. Their conversation drifted from work to life, to frustrations and regrets, but even as they talked, Eric's mind wasn't fully there. He found himself replaying moments from the office, dissecting every glance, every word Lacy had spoken that day. He hated how much power she still had over him, even when she wasn't in the room. As they left the bar, Justin clapped him on the shoulder. "You're handling this better than I expected, man." Eric gave a hollow laugh. "Am I?" "Yeah," Justin replied, squinting at him. "Just make sure you don't let her back in, not even a crack. People like her, they smell weakness." Eric didn't respond. He wasn't sure if Justin meant it as a warning or as advice, but either way, it gnawed at him. The next morning, Eric arrived at the office to find Lacy already there, even earlier than the day before. She was reviewing shipment reports, but her eyes darted up as soon as she saw him. For a heartbeat, she looked like she wanted to speak, but she stopped herself. He passed her without a word, but something about her presence felt heavier, more complicated than before. Midday, she finally approached his desk, her expression carefully neutral. "Eric," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "I know it's not my place, but I'd like to apologize." The words caught him off guard more than he wanted to admit. He kept his gaze locked on his screen, not trusting himself to look at her. "For what?" he asked, his tone sharp. "For how I ended things," she said softly. "For the way I dismissed your work, your life. I was wrong." A flicker of genuine emotion bled into her voice, and Eric, against every wall he'd built around himself, felt it worm its way through. "People don't change that fast," he replied, finally meeting her eyes. "So what is it you really want, Lacy?" For a second, she faltered. Her gaze dropped, her facade cracking. When she looked back at him, there was something raw, almost desperate, hiding in her expression. "I'm not sure anymore," she admitted. Eric watched her in silence, feeling the tide shift beneath their feet. He didn't trust her, not even a little. But in that moment, he realized something far more dangerous. He wasn't sure he trusted himself either. Eric didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes on her, letting the silence between them stretch out until it became almost unbearable. He could see her wrestle with it, shifting slightly on her feet like the weight of his stare alone made her uneasy. Good. Let her feel it. Let her sit in it the way he'd sat in his own discomfort for weeks after she walked out of his life. But then, something in her gaze changed. It softened, but it didn't waver. She wasn't backing down this time. "I know you probably think this is some kind of game," she continued, her voice lower now, more honest. "Maybe I thought it was too once. Maybe I thought I could just slip back in and, I don't know, pretend it never happened." Eric's jaw tightened. "You don't get to pretend, Lacy." "I know," she breathed, almost like it hurt her to admit it. I know I don't. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air felt heavy, thick with everything unsaid. She stood there, clutching the folder in her hands like it could shield her from the consequences of her own choices. He almost pitied her for that. Almost. Justin's words from the night before echoed in his mind. They smell weakness. And maybe Justin was right. Maybe this was the moment to draw the line in the sand, to keep her firmly on the outside of his life. But as much as Eric wanted to believe he could do that, something deeper gnawed at him, a part of him that wasn't finished yet. Go back to your desk, he said, his voice cold and controlled. She didn't argue. She just nodded, her shoulders stiff, and walked away without another word. But Eric wasn't free of her, not even close. Every time he glanced across the office, she was there, a constant reminder of what they had been and what they could never be again. Her presence pulled at something buried inside him, something tangled between anger and old affection, between resentment and the twisted satisfaction of seeing her now, on his turf, in his world, answering to him. That evening, as the office emptied out, he stayed behind, staring at the dim glow of his monitor. He heard her steps before he saw her, soft but deliberate. She lingered at the doorway of his office, hesitant. Eric, she said quietly, almost like she didn't want to disturb the air between them. Can we talk? Not as boss and employee, just us. He should have shut it down right then. He should have told her no, reminded her of the boundaries she herself had broken the moment she left him behind. But instead, he found himself gesturing to the chair across from his desk. She sat slowly, setting the folder aside, folding her hands in her lap like she wasn't sure what to do with them. I thought I wanted more, she admitted, her voice, brittle but honest. More excitement, more risk, more of everything you weren't. Eric kept his face neutral, his eyes cold. And did you find it? A bitter smile tugged at her lips. For a while, but it's strange, Eric. The people who promise you excitement usually don't stick around long enough to see you through the hard days. Her confession tasted like vindication, but it was hollow. It didn't fill the space she had left behind. You left because you thought I was boring, he reminded her, letting the words cut sharp and clean. Her gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers knotting together tightly. I thought stability meant stagnation. I didn't understand the difference until it was too late. There it was. The truth, ugly and exposed. You only understand now because it's convenient, he replied, his voice hardening. Because the fun ran out and you realized someone has to actually build the life you wanted. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked the moisture away quickly. Maybe, but even if that's true, I'm not here to make excuses. Then why are you here, Lacy? Her breath hitched, and when she looked at him, there was no more pretense, no more polished mask. Only raw, unfiltered honesty. Because you're the only person who ever saw me for who I really was, she said softly. And I threw that away. Eric's chest tightened. Part of him wanted to tear her down for the pain she'd caused, to make her feel every moment of rejection he'd suffered in silence. But another part, a quieter, more dangerous part, wanted her to suffer not by pushing her away, but by keeping her close, letting her see everything she lost, every day. Without a word, he stood and moved past her, leaving her sitting alone in the office. He didn't need to answer her. Not yet. Let her wonder. Let her wait. The next morning felt different, heavier, like the air itself carried the weight of everything left unsaid the night before. Eric had barely slept, but you wouldn't know it by looking at him. He wore his usual calm like armor, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression carved from stone. But inside, his mind wouldn't rest. He replayed her words over and over, the way she'd said it like she meant it. Because you're the only person who ever saw me for who I really was. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt like unfinished business. When he walked into the office, He found her already at her desk, typing away with mechanical focus. She looked tired, too, her eyes rimmed with subtle shadows, her posture stiffer than usual. But as soon as she saw him, she straightened, like she was determined not to let him see the cracks. Eric pretended not to notice. The day unfolded in a blur of meetings and reports, but every so often, his eyes would drift toward her almost involuntarily. He caught her watching him too, once during a logistics briefing. Her gaze wasn't the cold, calculating glance of someone playing a game anymore. No, this time it felt heavier, sadder, like she was carrying regret in her chest and it had started to suffocate her. By late afternoon, a storm broke over the city. Rain battered the office windows in relentless sheets, turning the sky a deep gray. Most of the staff left early, slipping out between meetings to avoid the worst of the weather, until only a few remained. Eric stayed, as did Lacy. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. He sat at his desk, finishing up a quarterly projection, when he heard her soft footsteps approach. He didn't look up right away. He let her stand there for a moment, waiting in that quiet tension, before finally lifting his eyes to meet hers. "I didn't want to leave things like that," she said, her voice low, steady but edged with something fragile. Eric's response was cold, automatic. "How you wanted to leave things stop mattering the day you walked out of my life." Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked down, swallowing whatever reply she'd been about to give. He thought she might back away then, fold under the weight of it, but she didn't. Instead, she surprised him. She stepped closer. "You have every right to hate me," she said softly. "I won't argue with that. I won't ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it." Eric studied her carefully, watching her face, her trembling fingers, the way she forced herself to hold his gaze despite the storm raging behind her eyes. This wasn't the woman who had left him craving more excitement. This was someone stripped raw by her own choices. "I don't hate you," he said finally, his voice sharp as a blade. "I just stopped caring." But it wasn't true. Not fully. They both knew it. She let out a breath, almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You're lying to yourself," she whispered. His eyes narrowed, cold steel flashing beneath. "Be very careful, Lacy." But she didn't stop. She stepped even closer, close enough now that he could see the faint sheen of moisture in her eyes, close enough that he could smell the rain clinging to her hair and jacket. "I thought I wanted a life full of sparks," she confessed, her words tumbling out like she couldn't hold them back anymore. "I thought I needed the fire, the danger, the thrill of the unknown. But all it gave me was burns, scars I can't hide." Eric clenched his jaw, emotions twisting hard in his chest. She kept going. "And now I'm here," she continued, her voice tight with the weight of regret. "Standing in front of the only man who ever gave me something real, and I can't even ask him to take me back because I know—" Her voice cracked just a little, "because I know I already destroyed what we had." The words hung between them, heavy, aching. Eric felt something shift deep inside, like a lock turning slowly, painfully against his will. His mind screamed at him to stay strong, to let her feel the consequences of her choices. But his heart, battered as it was, thudded painfully against his ribs. "You destroyed it," he said, his voice rough, "but you're still standing here, aren't you?" She nodded, tears finally slipping free. "Because I have nowhere else to go." For a heartbeat, neither of them breathed. Eric rose from his chair, closing the space between them until they were only inches apart. He could see every crack in her facade now, every tiny fracture she tried to hide. She wasn't just regretful. She was lost. Maybe that should have made him feel triumphant, but it didn't. "You really think you can fix this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him, broken yet defiant in her honesty. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I have to try." Eric's gaze held hers, unblinking, and for the first time in a long, painful while, he let himself wonder, just wonder, if he wanted her to. The rain outside turned from a storm to a steady downpour, tapping against the windows like a metronome, keeping time with Eric's racing pulse. He didn't move. Neither did she. They stood frozen in that moment, caught between everything they had been and everything they had lost. Lacy's breath trembled as she waited for his response. She didn't beg, didn't plead, but her eyes, those eyes that once sparkled with excitement for the life she thought she wanted, were now clouded with something deeper. Regret, need, maybe even fear. Eric hated that he could still read her so clearly. "You don't get to just try, Lacy," he finally said, his voice rough. "You left me like I was nothing. You made me feel like I wasn't enough." "I know," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "God, Eric, I know. Every day since I left, I've felt it." The silence was louder than I ever expected. The excitement faded fast, and when it did, there was no one left. No one who saw me. No one who cared what happened to me at the end of the night. Her words cracked through him like lightning, splintering his anger just enough for something rawer to bleed through. Pain. Old, buried pain. "You traded me for a good time?" Eric shot back, harsher than he intended, but he didn't stop himself. "You made me feel like stability was a curse, like my loyalty was some kind of burden." She flinched, the truth of his words landing hard. "I was wrong," she said, swallowing back tears. "I thought stability meant boredom, that it meant settling for less. But I didn't understand. Not until I realized the people chasing the fire never stay long enough to see if they burn the whole house down." Eric's chest tightened. There it was again. That honesty. That brutal bleeding. Honesty. She wasn't lying to him now. She wasn't wearing a mask. She was stripped down to the bone. "And what do you want now?" His voice was low, almost dangerous, because a part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. She looked him straight in the eyes, her gaze unflinching despite the tears shining in them. "I want the man who made me feel safe to be brave enough to let me back in." The words knocked the wind out of him more than he expected. She wasn't asking for a second chance out of pity or desperation. She was asking him to choose, to make a decision that would cost him more than pride. Eric turned away, pacing to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass in crooked lines. He could walk away. He could tell her no and mean it. He could protect himself, finally, from the woman who had once torn him open. But as he stared out into the gray blur of the city, he realized something cruel and undeniable. He didn't want to walk away. He wanted her to feel what he had felt. Every ache, every restless night, every moment of quiet agony. And the sharpest way to make her feel it wasn't by shutting her out. It was by letting her in and letting her see, day by day, what she had broken. Slowly, he turned back to her. "You want to come back?" he said, his voice like steel beneath velvet. "Then you work for it." Surprise flickered across her face, but she didn't hesitate. "I will." "You earn it," he continued, not softening an inch. "Every single day, you show me you understand what you lost. You don't get forgiveness handed to you, Lacy. You fight for it." "I will," she repeated, firmer this time, her chin lifting with determination. "Good," he said coldly. "Because if you fail me again, I won't be here next time." A beat of silence, heavy, final. Then, without waiting for her response, Eric walked past her, leaving her standing in the middle of his office with rain still dripping down the windows and her heart beating too fast in her chest. She didn't move. She stood there, her breath shaky but her spine straight, knowing this was the beginning of the longest uphill battle of her life. And for the first time, Eric felt a flicker of cruel satisfaction. She thought she had walked back into the same old story, but this time, he was the one writing the ending.